Bill and his associate, Tim Profeta, are very effective solicitors of support for this school and institute. When they came, they asked us for $2.5 million in cash right away. They didn't say, and you'll need to come and deliver a presentation to an esteemed audience. That came later. It is really an honor to be invited to speak at this week's summit and be part of the inaugural event for the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions here at Duke. Over the next few days, we will hear speeches and panel discussions that engage some of the leading thinkers on this issue, and it's forums like these that we believe really create a catalyst for thoughtful discussion and the development of the kinds of ideas and approaches that we really do need in this country at this time. I'm very excited to talk about the announcement that Bill's mentioned from last week about the $2.5 million that will support the climate change partnership to pool the expertise of the university's Nicholas School of Environment and Earth Science, the Nicholas Institute, the Center on Global Change, and Duke Energy. I think we are appropriately listed last in that roster. This university academic collaboration will focus on analyzing federal policy options for addressing greenhouse gas emissions, expanding research efforts, advancing the dialogue on climate change. As we make progress, the partners will share their findings with government, corporate, and environmental leaders nationwide. Now, this will be Duke Energy's primary climate change academic initiative, and it should come as no surprise to anyone that we're anchoring these efforts here in Durham. As the name suggests, our company and the university have a very long-standing relationship and indeed have a common heritage. We're here tonight in part to celebrate the generosity and vision of the Nicholas family, and that generosity really has enabled this kind of partnership. But the connection between Duke University and Duke Energy really goes back much, much further to another act of philanthropy over 80 years ago. Both institutions really reflect the initiative and the wealth of James Buchanan Duke, Buck Duke. Without his vision, neither would exist today in their present form. In 1911, when the federal government relieved Mr. Duke of the burden of running the Tobacco Trust, he found himself with an enormous amount of cash from the divestiture of so many tobacco companies, indeed all the tobacco companies. And he took this cash and this energy that he had, and I mean energy in the generic sense, and he moved to Charlotte. And there he drove the development of a small power company that he had founded in 1904. Now, Buck Duke had the vision to develop hydroelectric systems to power textile mills and drive the economic growth of the Piedmont region of the Carolinas. He expressly linked the value that he was creating by this electrification of this region to the needs of that region. And in the indenture of the Duke Endowment, written in 1924, Mr. Duke explained his purpose this way. He wrote, "For many years, I have engaged in the development of water powers in certain sections of the states of North and South Carolina. My ambition is that the revenues of such developments shall administer to the social welfare as the operation of such developments is administering to the economic welfare of the communities they serve. I have endeavored to make provision in some measure for the needs of mankind along physical, mental, and spiritual lines." And Mr. Duke defined what he meant in some measure by that term, because he defined it in cash, of course, which tended to be the way he defined most things. And in 1924 and 1925, he funded his new endowment with $107 million in cash, and substantially all the common stock of the entities that shortly after his death the following year would be renamed the Duke Power Company. The success, therefore, of Duke Power Company really fueled the expanded philanthropic efforts of the Duke Endowment, and included among those efforts, of course, was the continued support of Duke University. So our interest in climate change, our decision to act on that interest, and our selection of a vehicle for the academic aspect of this initiative all fit within the definition of who we are at Duke Energy and where we come from. More than our heritage, we believe that the players involved from the Institute, from the Nicholas School, and from Duke Energy all share a common mission: to identify and help to develop practical policy responses to climate change that are based on sound science and solid economics. We really believe that this partnership is well positioned to bring together other industry, academic, and think tank organizations to facilitate a meaningful policy discussion around climate change. That the Institute has brought together such a distinguished group for its inaugural event speaks to the credibility of its leadership and the importance of its mission. As I said, I'm very excited about the collaboration, but it's critically important that the partnership which we've announced bring more than participants to the table. It needs to provide a broader perspective of the challenges and the opportunities ahead. Now, over the past few minutes, I've given you a broad sense as to why we're joining forces with the Institute and with Duke University, and what we hope to achieve through the climate change partnership. But I'd like to step back and just talk for a moment about why we as a corporation are very engaged in the specific issue of climate change, why we're of the view that action must be taken in this country to address climate change, and why we think sound policy, and what we think sound policy has to include. In short, I want to explain why we consider climate change a business imperative, and why we think really others need to come to that conclusion as well. Now, as a business person, I'm not here tonight to talk about the science of climate change. In a meeting packed with environmental experts, I am way out of my league on that score. I am here to discuss how addressing climate change with sound policies makes sound business sense for Duke Energy Corporation. As you know, most of the developed world is already addressing climate change through the Kyoto Protocol. This summer, climate change was one of two issues on the agenda at Glen Eagles. While much of the world moves, in the United States, we are at a crossroads, and the alternatives that we're considering don't include continued inaction. Activity already is occurring in the country, a response to the strong feeling among so many citizens that global warming represents a fundamental environmental crisis. The problem is that actions by themselves can be ineffective, they can be inefficient, and they can even be counterproductive. And in the United States, concerns about the climate change issue have thus far resulted in a variety of local, state, and regional responses. To date, at least 7 states have enacted some form of climate change legislation. North Carolina, for example, is acting. It's formed a commission, the legislature just formed a commission to study possible statewide measures to address greenhouse gas emissions in North Carolina. 2 groups of state and local officials, one in the Northeast and one in the western states, are working to develop regional plans for reducing power plant emissions of carbon dioxide. The overarching objective of advancing policies to address global climate change is laudable, but a patchwork of state programs focused on the power industry cannot produce the requisite results and may really do little more than create a complex web of compliance requirements. In the absence of federal regulatory action, however, the results will likely be just such a patchwork of rules, and what we'll end up with is state-by-state chaos. That's the direction in which we are heading right now, and it has real economic implications. Until we have broad-based federal policies, there will be uncertainty around economic expansion and capital investment in very key sectors of our economy, including the energy industry, manufacturing, and transportation. Businesses need to know what the rules are, which behaviors will be rewarded, and which are going to be taxed or regulated. Industry must engage on this issue to help shape policy as it's being developed, instead of waiting for the policy to shape our business and define the future. Now, many corporations are moving forward with their own climate change initiatives, and these corporations are moving because they face the questions every day regarding these kinds of long-lived investments. Decisions are being made with 50-year shelf lives without any clear understanding of how this country will proceed on this very critical issue. At Duke Energy, we've come to the conclusion that U.S. public policy on global climate change should encourage a transition to lower carbon-intensive economy through a broad-based federal approach. A federal approach would be easier to integrate into a comprehensive global response than would a hodgepodge of state rules. And we think any U.S. climate change policy really needs to meet 4 obvious criteria. First of all, it needs to be economy-wide. It needs to be the federal government. Secondly, it needs to start now, Now, it can reduce emissions gradually, but we need to start now. Thirdly, it needs to be economically efficient. And fourthly, it needs to align with other energy and environmental policy objectives. Now, let's walk through the rationale very quickly for this first characteristic that we're targeting, an economy-wide solution. In the debate about global climate change, you hear a lot about power plants in the electric power industry, but that is really only one part of the story. 60% of the carbon dioxide emitted in this country comes from sources other than the power industry. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that we can easily address or effectively address this issue through the electric sector only. In fact, the U.S. emissions reductions that would have been required had we stuck with the Kyoto Protocol is almost as much as the total CO2 emitted by the electric industry in 2002. Now, unlike many pollutants, sulfur dioxide or NOx, for example, there is no technology available yet to reduce the emission of CO2. So for the electric sector alone to achieve Kyoto reductions, we'd essentially have to shut down the nation's fossil fuel generating plants. Now, we can't eliminate the use of coal and other fossil fuels in power generation in the near term without serious disruption to the economy. That's why a viable policy, a realistic policy to address global climate change, needs to consider emissions from all sources and all segments of the economy, not just one or two. Any reasonable approach to limiting greenhouse gas emissions will significantly affect the U.S. power industry. There's no question about that. But we can't limit it to that industry without unnecessarily magnifying the stress we place on the economy. 30% of U.S. carbon dioxide emissions are from the transportation sector. As with power plants, there's no existing control device today that can cut the carbon dioxide coming from our gasoline-powered engines. The only way to reduce emissions is to consume less fuel. Yet U.S. government fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks haven't changed since 1990. And the average fuel efficiency for cars and trucks fell from 22.1 miles per gallon in 1988 to 20.4 miles per gallon in 2001. So we're actually heading in the wrong direction. The remaining 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions in this country come from other segments of the economy, segments as varied as industry, heavy manufacturing, and residential space heating. We need a broad-based response, not targeted regulation. And we need that in order to be effective, an economy-wide approach that sends the right signals to companies and individual consumers alike to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sources is going to be the most effective approach. The enormity of this task and the paucity of available technological tools make it crucial that we get the most efficient solutions possible. We will continue to explore a range of policy options through the Climate Change Policy Partnership and other forums. Duke Energy believes a carbon tax, however, which addresses greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of the economy, is probably the best available approach. Now, tax, as everyone's aware, is a four-letter word in the American political environment today. But our view is that a carbon tax must be an option considered in the federal policy debate. If the federal government is going to influence behavior, it should do so through the most efficient means. And in this case, a carbon tax, based on the carbon content of fossil fuels, is a better approach than regulatory alternatives such as cap-and-trade regimes. A tax can be structured to be revenue neutral, that is, in aggregate to take no new money from the economy. The greatest attraction from the carbon tax is its simplicity and the fact that it allows us to share the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy, minimizing the economic disruption. Given the long-term nature of the climate change issue and the capital intensity of energy investments, many economists recommend that a carbon tax start at a relatively modest level and increase slowly over time. And this does speak to the second characteristic of a workable policy, to start now and reduce emissions gradually to have the right impact. This approach would minimize disruptive jolts to the economy and yet send clear price signals to the marketplace about the need for long-term investments in practices and technologies that reduce emissions. A well-crafted carbon tax would provide everybody with the right incentive for conservation. It would promote higher utilization of existing generating plants that are low emitters of carbon and encourage low-carbon fuel choices for the future. It would also encourage development of new technologies that we don't have in place at this time. The third premise of a good policy would be an economically efficient policy. By setting a carbon price, a carbon tax would provide financial motivation for firms and households to take least cost steps to shift or reduce energy consumption and thereby reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For this reason, many economists feel that a carbon tax is more efficient than a regulatory mechanism for addressing climate change. The Congressional Budget Office recently concluded that a policy approach that fixes costs, such as a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade program with a safety valve price limit, is much more likely to be cost-effective over the long term than a regulatory approach that fixes a level of emissions regardless of the cost. The CBO study notes that a carbon tax would be relatively simple to administer. Measures of carbon content in fuels are readily available, and the program could reach virtually all the fuel consumed in this society with taxing as few as 2,000 entities. Even a modest tax on carbon content of fuels sends a strong economic signal. If global warming is being aggravated by human activity, that signal corrects for what the economists would call an externality and really represents the actual cost of using the fossil fuels. Moreover, a carbon tax sends a signal to everyone, enabling us to make those decisions as a society that reduce or altogether eliminate those uses of fossil fuels that are providing the least value, not those uses which are the easiest for the government to regulate. Now, this is the best approach for addressing climate change without jeopardizing economic growth and competitiveness. The final criteria is that climate policy should align with other energy and environmental policy objectives. Carbon tax would serve other national policy goals, such as encouraging energy efficiency and conservation, mitigating air pollution, and decreasing the U.S. dependence on foreign sources of energy. Now, a carbon tax could, of course, raise significant new revenues, and some economists have argued that the federal government needs such new revenues. One would think today they could argue that even more strongly. Many economists, however, have analyzed the use of a carbon tax as one element of a revenue-neutral tax reform policy, in particular as a means to shift taxation away from the activities that society wishes to encourage, such as labor and investment, and onto activities that society wishes to discourage, such as alcohol consumption or the emission of greenhouse gases. We used to say tobacco consumption there, but I guess in deference to Mr. Duke, we've now said alcohol consumption instead. The CBO's analysis outlined a moderate carbon tax policy and showed that revenues would be generated for the government of about $208 billion over a 10-year period. Such funds could be used to offset revenue losses from cuts in other taxes or to alleviate the impact of the carbon tax on particularly hard-hit groups. Now, obviously, we at Duke Energy find the carbon tax approach tremendously attractive relative to other alternatives. But that's just our assessment based on our specific criteria that I've just shared with you. Others can and others do differ. And one of the appealing aspects of the partnership is that it will bring analysis and study to bear on this and other approaches to this climate change issue, and will help really drive alignment and consensus. Global climate change is an issue that needs to be addressed both nationally and internationally. If industry doesn't become involved in shaping a policy response, others will. At Duke Energy, we are gratified that ours is a record of low emissions intensity, and we are committed to taking steps that will eventually lower our absolute greenhouse gas emissions. We'll do that through a balanced portfolio of nuclear, gas, hydro, and coal, and even coal, as I said. Electricity demand is critical to the growth of our economy, and to meet growing demand in the short term, we're looking at the construction of new gas or coal-fired plants. Now, it's worth noting that a new coal facility reduces carbon dioxide emissions by close to 20% when compared to the average coal plant in operation today, and that's really just due to the greater efficiency of the new technology. Our long-term generation strategy includes adding new nuclear plants, which produce absolutely no greenhouse gas emissions. But the lead time won't make new nuclear plants available in time to meet our customers' most immediate needs. Now, at the same time, we will be working with others in the industry to evaluate new technologies that are available to solve these problems. As a company, we want to be a part of the solution to global climate change, and we see that as a varied, multifaceted solution. What all of us need from our regulators and from our legislators is to understand what the rules are going to be, what behaviors will be rewarded, and which behaviors will be penalized. Only then will we know how to invest in the right solutions so that we do not disadvantage our customers or our investors. Before I close, there's another important point that I want to identify. Our international competitors, sometimes motivated by mandatory emissions reductions, have gotten a head start in a series of interesting technological areas. Europe leads in wind power technology right now. Japan is a world leader in solar technology and hybrid cars. All you have to do is look out in the parking lot. I'm sure there's a whole little flock of Priuses. And clarifying a mandate in this country to become less carbon intensive will spur the kind of innovation and commercial application that in the last century propelled us to become such a dynamic economy. Started out this evening talking about the Climate Change Policy Partnership, and that's where I'm going to end. We are, as I've said, very excited about the collaboration and very excited about the work that lies ahead. I'm hopeful that we'll find other partners to join us in this endeavor, particularly those involved in agriculture, forestry products, and transportation, who share the vision that we need practical policy responses to climate change, and we need them now. We need them based on sound science and solid economics. The partnership we've announced will produce valuable results along these lines, but it can only reach its full potential if more parties with varied expertise and capabilities join us. We must get this right, we must get it right for business, and we must get it right for society. It is an imperative. I thank you very much for your attention.
In the traditional spirit, of course, in academics, Richard has graciously agreed to take some questions from the audience for a few minutes before our next scheduled event.
If I'd known there were going to be questions, it would have been $35.50.
Marty Hofford here.
Quick question. You mentioned the paucity of alternative energy technology. Many of us think that that may be one of the major problems, because I think opinion is beginning to shift that we really do need to do something. And we've lost a tremendous amount of time, many, many decades since the Carter administration actually had an energy policy. I mean, to what extent do you think that federal initiatives in research and development to radically transform our global energy system, which is what we really have to do, are going to be needed alongside of those that industry, power utilities, and automobile companies are going to be.
I trust everybody heard the question. Did the people in the back hear the question? No. Well, let me try to paraphrase the question and tell me if I get this right. The question is whether it refers to the comment that we have a paucity of technological tools available to help us with this, and whether we think it would be critical that the federal government launch some sort of major technology initiative to try to develop new technologies that will address the greenhouse gas emissions problem, basically. Well, I don't know I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that, because we don't stand here and I don't stand here and pretend to know the real answer to the question of, well, where does the trajectory of emissions and CO2 in the atmosphere have to level off, or how far does it have to decline to rectify or stabilize the situation. But candidly, I think we have to move forward on the assumption that, yes, we do have to launch forward in a major technological initiative, because the price of not doing it and then finding out 10 years from now that you were wrong would be unacceptable. And so I think it is necessary. And if you look at the technologies that are visible and on the cusp, they include things like coal gasification, which requires some advances in sequestration, which may or may not be there. And I think by any definition is a temporary kind of fix. It's not a permanent fix, obviously. It includes nuclear that we can see right now, where you have, whatever its issues might be, you have an opportunity to deal with energy needs without creating greenhouse gases. And you do have technologies that have been uneconomical up to this point that may well be economical when you look at oil at, forget $65 a barrel or wherever it closed today, but if you talk about oil at $40 a barrel and gas at $7, then you suddenly make economical a bunch of things that were not economical 2-3 years ago. And so there is sort of a short-term chunk of technologies that I think we'll see developed and will start to make a difference. But I think you're looking at longer-term, more fundamental research, and I think we are very much in favor of that as part of the solution. That's just going to be providing answers that are 5, 10, 15 years out, not answers that are available in 2, 3, 5 years.
I have a question as to whether you all look into biofuels as an immediately available opportunity, given the use of, say, palm oils from Malaysia. I know the Europeans are very active in importing straight oils there, and what you all may or may not see as an opportunity there.
If anybody didn't hear, the question was about biofuels and the site of citing palm oil's imports into Europe. I think we've looked at that. We obviously all have heard about the ethanol opportunity. Maybe it's an opportunity for ethanol farmers, I'm not sure, but it's an opportunity for somebody. I think that's one of the options that have to be pursued. I don't think we view it as a major factor in producing electricity over the next 5 to 10 years. But it's out there, and if you pursue enough of these options, you're going to make a difference, and that's one of the options that could make a difference. I think the economics are unclear in some cases. The ethanol economics are certainly unclear. They're very clear in Washington, but they're unclear outside of Washington.
One more, Chris.
Deregulation of the utility industry has been a start-stop process, particularly after the California energy crisis. And I was just wondering, when you're calling for a carbon tax, that's federal carbon taxes, essentially another layer of regulation, where do you feel the deregulation regulation plays into meeting a challenge of global climate change?
Well, the question is, how does deregulation of the electric industry play into the approaches on global climate change, and particularly how does a carbon tax fit into that picture? I think they're really two separate questions, if you'll let me bifurcate them for a second. We believe a carbon tax is attractive because it doesn't regulate. I think part of the problem with regulation is that even if you get it right on day one, and a lot of times you don't get it right on day one, but even if you do, people are smart and people are busy and people are greedy, and they will eventually end run it. And I mean, look at the SUVs, look at the hybrids, look at you look at the CAFE standards, and you say, well, did they work? Well, I don't think so. And so in a way, part of the problem is that if you want to have an effect and you want it to be widespread across the economy, you've got a real challenge if you're going to rely on regulation. And so one of the things that we find appealing about a carbon tax is that it is omnipresent, that if you put a tax on the carbon content of fuel, it will affect everybody, and it'll be very hard to end run that. So we think it has that approach, and that is different than trying to regulate the solution, which we think is difficult and less likely to succeed. Even though it may make us feel better initially, because we'll say we will take so many tons of CO2 out of the stream. The question of how electric deregulation plays into this, I think, is really a separate question, is interesting as well. problem in deregulation is that you're asking private investors to take a lot of risk as it is in the construction and provision of generating plants. And if you add on top of that the requirement that they have more and more capital-intensive solutions, then the risk that they look at is greater and greater. And I think you run the risk that that kind of deregulation becomes less and less attractive for investors. It may lead to having more generation built by your conventional vertically integrated utilities where they have this essentially contract back with the customers that the customers will take this at a certain price. In this country at this point, we've got a mix of regions in which there is deregulation. In the Midwest, New England, far West California, there's wholesale deregulation. And regions like North and South Carolina, really the whole Southeast, where the industry is really substantially the way it was 40 years ago. And I think we'll see how it plays out. We'll have sort of a test tube here because we'll have different economic mechanisms in place in these different markets, and we'll see how the different markets deal with it. I think there's enough fluidity in the system so that the needs will be met, and the system will adjust to provide the power if the rules are defined and we're told this is how we want to proceed. The problem is that right now the industry is sitting around, whether you're regulated or unregulated or deregulated, and you're saying, we don't understand what the playing rules are. We don't know what you're going to tax or what you're going to regulate, and therefore it's a little difficult for us to make an investment that might be sitting there generating power for 40 years.